Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Park Community Church. For those of you I haven't met, my name's Trevor. I serve as one of the pastors here, and it's great to be with you all this morning. Hey, if you could do something for me right at the top, would you put in the chat something you're looking forward to? Something you're looking forward to. I want to know what that is for you. And so it could be something like a football game in the afternoon. The Bears game's coming on at noon. And so maybe it's something like lunch plans. Maybe it's even a nap, right? Just some of that Sunday afternoon bliss. But let me know in the chat what it is you're looking forward to, even if it's something further ahead, like if you've got some sweet vacation or some travel plans you're looking forward to. Let me know what you're looking forward to in there. And if I could just say real quick, can we give maybe a shout out in the chat as well to Alan Hudson for this set design. This is great, and it's a perfect lead into what I'm about to say here. And so let me just say, I want to give my answer to the chat question, right? And this is what it is, right? So I know that this is going to be a little controversial. I posed it to the band beforehand, and I got some controversy there. So we'll just see how this goes for us. But let me just say, the thing that I'm looking forward to is the Christmas season. Right? It is the season of Christmas that is near and dear to my heart and is just close ahead down the road. And so much so that my wife and I, we've actually been debating lately. We've been kind of weighing the pros and cons. We've been considering the idea, and I know that this is going to be a shock maybe to some people, but we're considering the idea of putting up our Christmas tree on November 1st. Right? And I know that that's a big deal. I get that Thanksgiving is a season that deserves its month, right? It's a holiday that deserves that. It should get that. I understand all that. I'm just saying 2020 has been quite a year, and we are just trying to find some ways to insert a little joy into life, find some ways to bring a little joy into our rhythms. And I think the Christmas tree might actually be able to deliver that. And if ever there was a year, right, if ever there was a year to have Christmas for 2 months instead of just one, I feel like this would be it, right? And so maybe let me know what your opinion is on that. Feel free to share that. So I'm going to watch some of these come in now. There's a little bit of a delay. But Scott is looking forward to COVID being over. Completely agree with that. Jasmine looking forward to being in church. I wish that could be the case as well. It's fun just to be up here. The Goodalls, apple cider donuts this morning. That looks great. That sounds fun. I had some of those just a couple of weeks ago. Seeing old friends, Jana. All right, so thanks for putting that in there. Let me just say, the thing that I've been looking forward to, apart from Christmas, has actually been Romans 12, right? What we're jumping into today. And so I have noticed that none of you have said my sermon yet, but we're going there anyways. So feel free to open up your Bibles to Romans chapter 12 or navigate on your devices to Romans chapter 12, because that's where we're going to be hanging out today and camping out there, which is what I've been looking forward to. And honestly, we have been working at a fast pace lately. We've been working through these pages pretty quickly, and now we're going to slow down a little bit, right? We took one chapter at a time per week the past 3 weeks, but now that we finally arrived at chapter 12, we're going to start to slow down and work through these pages a little less quickly. Right, because honestly, I think that there's something to be said, right, for looking forward to things. There's something to be said for that. But also, I think there's something to the idea of slowing down, right? Because we want to have things we're excited about, things we're anticipating in life. But also, at the same time, I think there's things in life that we just wish would slow down. And I don't know what that is for you. Maybe you've got adult children, right? And they're all grown up now and they've got jobs. Maybe they have kids of their own and their lives are just so busy that it feels like it's very difficult just to get some time with them. And so you wish things would just slow down with them a little bit so you could spend a little bit more time with them, right? Or maybe you've got young kids in the house, right? You've got some small ones running around, but all of a sudden you're looking at them and you're thinking, hey, you don't look so young anymore. You don't look so small anymore. Can we slow this process down because you're growing up a little bit too quick for me? Right? Or maybe it's just that life in general feels fast. Or that life in general feels busy, right? You look back over the 6 months, you're like, man, where did that go? And you think life is just starting to feel like that old Alabama song. Right? I'm in a hurry to get things done, and I rush and rush until life's no fun. My wife told me no one was going to know what that song was. And so if there's anybody out there, give me something. Give me a shout out in the chat. Let me know. But that's why, right, I think there's something to be said for slowing down. And that's why the title of this sermon today is actually just that. Right? It's slow down, because I felt like the area that God has been pressing into me on lately, and the area that he wants to address with us as a people, is this idea of slowing down. that we need to slow down as a people. And so that's the title of the sermon. If you're taking notes, go ahead and throw that at the top in big block letters, slow down. And then also, we do have a structure that's going to help guide us through this passage as well. We've got a table of contents, 3 points, and I'll just share those with you now. We've got some homework, we've got the reason why, and we have practices of participation. We got those 3 points, right? Some homework, the reason why, and practices of participation. That's where we're going this morning. So let's go ahead and jump in with those, right? The first point, some homework. All right, so verse 1 of the passage, open up to that. Romans 12, verse 1, it reads like this, right? Paul, the author of the book, he's saying this. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Right? And so what's happening here, Paul is making an appeal, right? He's telling these churches in Rome that there's something that they have to do. And initially what he's saying is that you've got to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, right? That's what he's saying. And that language there of living sacrifice, it actually would have been somewhat familiar to his original audience, right? Because this idea of animal sacrifice, it was kind of part and parcel of their culture and even their understanding of religious worship. So this would have made sense to them, but there's also something about this language that would have been striking. And there's a couple pieces. Actually, the whole living piece was striking, and then also the idea that they themselves were the sacrifice. Because typically the way it worked is that they would present other things as sacrifices, right? Like maybe a bird or a goat or a bull. And the ritual would end in their death, right? And so there was no life about it. And that was kind of the prescribed manner of worship. That was how it took place. But Paul is twisting that here. And he's saying instead of doing that, he's saying that that's not what you're supposed to do, because God doesn't want your birds and your goats and your bulls. He wants you. He wants you, and so present yourselves as a living sacrifice. And he calls that our spiritual worship. And what that means is that worship for us, right, as followers of Jesus, it's not just about fulfilling these steps perfectly in some worship ritual or some religious ritual. And it's actually not even just about the pieces of our lives that we would typically consider religious. But he's saying that our worship is about our entire way of life. Right? It's about the entire way that we shape and live our lives. And he's calling that our spiritual worship. And so he's saying to live in such a way that your whole life is worshipful unto God. That's the initial command here. But then he goes into verse 2, and he expands this a little bit further. And this is what he says there. He says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Right? And so this is what we see here when we take these two verses, 1 and 2 in connection. Right? Paul's appeal is for them to present their bodies as a living sacrifice, which means to view their entire way of life as how they worship God. And then he presents these two verbs here to kind of give further clarity, to unpack what that actually looks like. And the first one is do not be conformed. Right? Do not be conformed to this world. And what that means is that there are actually forces that surround us in this world that will try and pressure us and shape us into a way of life that's dishonoring to God. Right, that's out of step with God. Right, that would try and shape, that the world would try and shape us into a way of life that's lived according to its own priorities, right, its own values, its own way of life. And Paul's saying, don't let that happen. Right, don't let that take place. Resist that. Don't be conformed. Right, so that's the first one. And then the second one is, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. And so this one comes in the positive, but what's fascinating about it is that it's actually a passive verb. And so even though we're commanded to do this, we're not the active agent in it. Right? It's actually structured that way to show that this is something that the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, brings about in us. But we're also commanded to do it. So we do have a role to play. And our role is that we're supposed to participate with the Spirit of God in our transformation and in our renewal. All right, and so the summary explanation here, right, is that Paul's appeal is for us to present our bodies as a living sacrifice, to shape our entire lives as how we worship God. And we do that by resisting these pressures that would conform us to a way of life that's dishonoring to God, but then also to participate with the Spirit of God in our renewal. And so he's saying then the result of this, what happens when we do this, is actually that we're able to test and discern and know what the will of God is in certain situations. And I think he means that in a broad sense, right? That when it comes to the major decisions of our lives, that we'll have a sense of how God is leading us. Right? Maybe not right away, but at least one step at a time we know. Right? When it comes to things like where we live, right, to the jobs we say yes to and to the jobs we say no to, right, who we get married to, if we get married. I think these are all part of that. But then also, I think this also includes just small moments in everyday life, right? Just little moments about how we're going to respond to this person in that situation, right? Or how we're going to handle this interruption in our schedule or this inconvenient thing that we weren't expecting. I think the will of God for us includes even how we respond to those things. And living in this way helps us to understand how God would have us respond and how he would have us live. Right? And so that's kind of the summary explanation. And so really what Paul has given us here in laying this out is some homework. Right? He's given us some things that we have to do, some things that we have to put into practice, some things that we have to do in reshaping our lives. And I think before we jump into that, before we move into kind of the nitty-gritty and the particulars of what he's telling us to do, I think we first need to just ask the question, why? Right? He's telling us to disrupt and to reshape our entire way of life. And the question is why? Right? Why should we do that? Because aren't we already busy? Or don't we already have enough on our plates? And if the whole point of this sermon is to slow down, then how are we supposed to accomplish that by just adding another thing to an already full life, to an already overflowing plate? That doesn't seem to add up. And let me just say, thankfully, we don't have to just make up an answer to those questions because Paul himself addresses them. And so it's to move into the second point now that I want to look into his answer to those questions and how he addresses them. And so it's with that we're going to move into that now. Second point, the reason why. The reason why. And this is what we see, right? If we go back to verse 1, we see that Paul's appeal actually isn't just coming out of nowhere, but he gives us some indication there in what he's grounding this in. And this is what he says. He says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God. Right? And so we see from those two words, the therefore and by the mercies of God, from those two pieces, we have a sense of what God is talking about. We have a sense of what Paul is talking about here, what he's saying. And this is what we see. We see that the entire argument is grounded not just in the past, in the last few lines of the previous chapter, but it's actually in everything that Paul has written up until that point. Right? It's grounded in the entire letter, right, from chapters 1 all the way to 11. That's what the ground is for the appeal. And so for that reason, I think it's worthwhile for us just to revisit kind of the scope of that argument and see exactly why Paul is telling us to do these things and why we should be glad to do them. Right? And this is what we see. This is what we see. This is the structure. 1, 16, and 17 is the thesis. We go all the way back to the beginning. This is what we see. And this is what it says. Paul, right at the beginning, he says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation. It's the power of God for salvation, meaning it's the only thing that can bring about healing. Right? It's the only cure. It's the only cure. And it's the only thing that can make us right with God. And then in verse 17, he adds also that it reveals the righteousness of God. Right? Those are the two pieces that he gives. And so those two themes are central to the entire book. Right? Those are the claims that he makes. And then after that, he moves into the rest of the book to show how each of those are true. And the second claim, he comes about that one primarily in chapters 9 through 11, right? That the gospel reveals the righteousness of God. Because the past few weeks where we were just hanging out there in that excursus about the Jewish people, we saw that Paul goes into handling this idea of God being unjust and whether or not God is righteous. Right? And what we see there is that what we see in the gospel is that actually if all we ever had from God was what we deserved, all we would have is judgment. Right? That's what would actually be justice for us. But in the gospel, we see that we also get mercy. And that's how we're able to have salvation. And so the gospel reveals the righteousness of God to us because it reveals his mercy. And that's what we see in 9 through 11, right, as it's proving that second claim of the thesis. But then if we come back to the first claim, right, that the gospel is the power of God for salvation, we see that that's primarily what he addresses in chapters 1 through 8. And what's important about this is that in chapter 8 and chapter 12, there's actually a pretty close thematic connection there. Right? He picks up the same thread in chapter 12 that he leaves off in 8, and we'll see that as we work through it. But this is what we see. Right? In the opening movement in this argument, to show that the gospel is the power of God for salvation, his first move is to show that we are all actually in need of something for salvation, right? That we need something for healing. And he does so by showing us that we're all sick. He does so by arguing the point, metaphorically speaking, that we're all sick, that we have this thing called sin, which is a sickness that is universal to humanity, right? That every one of us has the sickness that the Bible calls sin, right, that Paul brings up in this opening section. And this is how he argues that point. Right? He talks about, in Romans 3:10, he talks about, he says that there are none who are righteous, right? No, not even one. There's not one person who hasn't been infected by this concept of sin, right? Which is basically this idea of failing to live in accord with righteousness, of failing to live in a way that's in accord with love. And so he's saying that we all have this, and you can tell that we have this, that we've been infected by this thing called sin because you can see the symptoms in our lives. Right, it flares up, and you can see the evidence in the way that we treat other people, in the way that we treat ourselves. You can see the symptoms in our lives. And so he makes that claim, right, in 3:10. There are none who are righteous. Everyone's been infected. And then he points to several different things to show that that's true, one of them being our use of language. And this is what he says in 3:13. Right, he says, the venom of asps is under their lips. The venom of asps is under their lips. Right, and an asp being a poisonous snake, the cobra probably would have fit into that category, right? But it's talking about the way that we use language and the way that we use words, and that we have a tendency to use them in a way that's damaging to other people, right? That we actually spit words like poison at other people, and we cause them harm, right? We inflict damage upon them with our use of words. And the thing is, we all know that that's true because we've felt that. We've been on the receiving end of some of that poison. And the thing is, sometimes we get these words, right? Somebody will say something to us and it just sits in our chest and you just can't shake it, right? It sits there like poison, and it can be an incredibly difficult feeling to shake. And so we know that this is a reality because we've felt it. But I think if we're honest, we also know that we've been on the other end of this as well. We've been the ones to deal out some poison of our own. For example, I'll just put myself on example, right? If we were to take a transcript of everything I said from the past 6 months, right? Every time I snapped at one of my kids, every time I spoke harshly either to or about someone, if every passing comment and conversation was recorded and I had to sit and read through all of that, I can bet, I would believe that I would come across some poison in there. Right? I would find some poison. And the thing is, I'm a pastor. I'm way more holy than the rest of you, so I can't even imagine how bad yours would be. That's a joke. But the reality is, no matter who it is, you take that transcript, you're going to find some poison. Right? We're all going to have that. And the thing is, it's not just about us misspeaking, right, or saying something that we didn't mean. Because the Bible says elsewhere, Matthew 12:34, it says, for out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, which means that the words that we speak, they indicate something about the condition of our hearts. And so if our words are poison, it's because they're coming from a poisonous heart. Right? They're coming from a heart that's been infected by sin, which is true for all of us, right? Because sin is a sickness that we all have. Right? We're all sick. Right? And that's Paul's first move in the argument from 1:18 to 3:20. And then after that, after introducing the need, he then brings up the solution from 3:21 all the way to the end of chapter 4. And basically what he does there is he brings him up, right? He brings up Jesus Christ. He brings him up. And it's all good news for a while because he's talking about this concept of justification, and he's kind of celebrating it. And basically the idea is just that when we place faith in Jesus Christ, we are justified before God. We're justified before him, as if we really had lived out the law of God in perfection throughout the entirety of our lives. We're justified before him. Or another way to put it is that in the eyes of God, we're declared to be healthy. We're declared to be healthy, as if the sickness of sin no longer does afflict us. Right? In the eyes of God, we're given a clean bill of health. But there's an important nuance there. There's an important nuance that we need to make note of. Because essentially, this is the breakdown, right? That what our justification means is that we have a clean bill of health. Our status reads healthy, right? We're justified. But experientially, we're still sick, right? Our status reads healthy, but experientially, we're still sick. And we can see that because what happens after this section, chapters 5 and 6, he goes on this run kind of just exploring and talking about all these benefits, all the positives of our newfound health. But then when he gets to chapter 7, he starts to explain something a little bit different. Now, I like to talk about chapter 7 as the fine print, right? The fine print, because what chapter 7 feels like to me, it feels a whole lot like that part in the commercial, right, where this narrator reads out in a super calm and soothing voice this huge list of terrifying potential side effects on some experimental medicine while you watch some beautiful family play Frisbee in the park. Right? That's what chapter 7 feels like to me, because what Paul explains and essentially confesses there in chapter 7 is that even though we've been justified, right, and our status says healthy, we still struggle with sin. We still struggle. Right, we still continue to use words like poison. We still get jealous and insecure. We still have fits of anger. We make stupid decisions, right? We speak when we should listen and we're silent when we should speak. We still struggle with sin. And we know that because we can see the symptoms in our lives. And we know we're not perfect. And I think for some of us, our experience with the Christian life has been something kind of like this, right? Where we came to faith and immediately there was so much joy. There was so much joy, and there was this feeling of peace that we had never experienced before, and there was this fullness of life that we walked in and enjoyed, and for a little while, things just seemed simpler. Right? They just seemed better. But then as time went by, and the pace of life just kept picking up, and it just kept picking up a little bit faster and a little bit faster, all of a sudden, we realized that it's been years since we felt like that. And all of a sudden we catch ourselves looking back, and all of that, the joy and the peace and the life that we used to feel, it just feels like this fading and distant memory out of another life. It feels so far away. It can feel so far away. And sometimes we get to the place where we're just asking the question, am I missing something? I've got to be missing something, because I'm pretty sure the Bible talks about joy. And it mentions peace, and I feel like it says a whole lot about life. So why is that not my experience? Why is my life not better? And the answer is, it's because you're still sick. It's because you're still sick. And while our justification is a wonderful and a marvelous and a spectacular thing, and it truly is, it didn't make you better. It didn't make you healed. You're still sick, which is why Paul doesn't just close down the book after chapter 6. It's why he has to keep writing and give us the fine print in chapter 7 and then move into what he does here in chapter 8. Because in chapter 8, he keeps things going, and he lays out here what I like to call is essentially our ongoing treatment plan for how we continue to deal with our sickness and be healed throughout the rest of our lives. Right, for how we participate in the work of our healing. And this is what we see. He says this in Romans 8, verses 5 and 6, actually. For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh. Right, that's the first option, the flesh. But those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit. Second option. Right, so we've got flesh and spirit. For to set the mind on the flesh is death. Right, is death, is the absence of joy, the absence of peace, the absence of life. But to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace, and you might as well throw joy in there as well. Right, you might as well toss it in. And so what we see here is that we have a choice. Right, yes, we've been justified before God. We're declared healthy. But when it comes to the ongoing work of our healing, we have a choice in how we'll respond. And so it works like this, right? The Spirit of God functions as our doctor or our nurse and administers doses of the gospel to us like medicine, right? On an ongoing basis to continue to bring about our healing throughout our lives. And our choice is either to shape our lives in such a way that we're able to live in that medicine, right? To receive that medicine, to soak in it, and to shape our lives according to it. Or we reject it, right? Because that's what the alternative is. Right, to reject the Spirit of God, to reject that medicine, to believe the gospel, to believe that it saves us at least, but to reject any of the pieces of it that would actually bring about change in our lives. Right, to reject, for example, that our significance isn't actually found in our accomplishments, right, that they have nothing to do with it. Or to reject that God can actually love us and does love us even in the midst of our mess, right, no matter what we've done, no matter how messy it is, even in this very moment. Right, or to reject the idea that his opinion is the one that actually matters. And if he's pleased with us, then who cares what other people think? Right, especially if they're outside of our circle, if they're not in the tight inner circle, then who cares? If God is pleased with us, then why does that matter? We have the choice to either receive that medicine and to shape our lives according to it, or to reject it. And that idea of that choice is actually the same thread that Paul picks up on in chapter 12. And that's where we see the connection between these chapters. When he says in chapter 12, in our passage, in verse 2, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Because the truth is, there are forces in this world that surround us that will try and push and prod and pressure us into living in such a way that we're out of step with the Spirit. We're out of step with God. And they try and push us into a way of life so that instead of the sin in our lives being restrained, it's actually exacerbated. Right? And so instead of our condition improving, it just keeps getting worse. Right? And the symptoms of sin, they keep flaring up in our lives, so much so that we start to believe that they're actually beyond our control, that there is nothing we can do about it. And if I'm honest, we ask, why is the joy missing? Where did the peace go to? Why don't I have a fuller life? Well, why? I'm confused about this. And when in reality, it's because we've allowed ourselves to be shaped in such a way that we're out of step with God and we're out of step with the Spirit. We've allowed our lives to be conformed to such a degree that renewal is almost impossible, that transformation is almost impossible. And the thing is, I think we have a tendency to kind of take this idea and our imagination runs with it and we fill in the details in the most drastic way. We think that this looks like, somebody having an affair and then, their marriage blows up, they slip into alcoholism and they lose their job and they plunge into debt and isolation and everything just swirls into chaos. We paint some picture that we can put very far away from us. When in actuality, I think this is something that is far more subtle than we would ever realize. I think this is something that's actually worked its way into our lives far more than we even think, because it's subtle. And if I'm honest, at the area that I felt God pressing into lately, that I feel like He wants to address with us, is just that we've been living in too much of a hurry. We've been living just at too fast of a pace. We've been living at a pace that's just a little bit too quick for us. And I know that at first that sounds like a very small thing. That sounds very small. And you're probably thinking, yeah, well, my life's busy, sure, but everybody's life's busy, right? That's the norm. And I'm not doing anything wrong. It's not going to hurt anything. I'm just trying to live a full life. Right? There are things I want to do. There's things I want to see and experience. There's things I want to accomplish. And so I'm just trying to make good use of my time. And I mean, yeah, life's busy and I'm a little bit tired and worn out, but who's not? Right? Who doesn't live that way? And what's really the harm in that anyways? And let me just say, I think it's a whole lot more harmful than we realize. It's a whole lot more destructive than we would ever imagine, because I'd actually argue that the chances are good that we've slipped into a way of life that's trying to destroy us. I'd argue that the chances are pretty decent that we've actually slipped into a way of life that's designed to bring about our ruin. All right, let me just walk through a few examples, right? Just to kind of drill down on this for us. All right, so for example, take the times recently in your life when you've treated the people you love the most with the greatest degrees of insensitivity and impatience. All right, with the greatest degree of insensitivity and impatience. Right, like when you blew up on your kids. You got so frustrated with them and you just lost it. Right, how much of the time is that because you're in a hurry and they're not moving fast enough? Right, they're not moving quick enough. And in our impatience, we lose it. It's because we're in a hurry. Or take another example. Maybe there was a time where you were at work and a friend called. Maybe it was your spouse, somebody who was having a hard day. Somebody who was struggling, and they just needed you to care for them and to listen to them. But the way you went about it is you answered the phone, but you just kind of kept plugging away on your laptop, scrolling over emails, half in the conversation, half out. And after about a minute, they realize you're not listening anyways, and you're just brushing them off. Right? And so the call ends, and you didn't give another thought to it. You just got back to work because you had a deadline to meet. You were in a hurry. So often, we treat the people that we love the most with such insensitivity and such impatience and such lack of care. And it's just because we're in a hurry. We're in a rush. Or maybe take another example. This one may be a little bit more broad, right? Road rage. I think that's probably familiar to a lot of us, the idea of road rage. And let me just ask, how often is the anger that you feel on the road because someone in front of you is slowing you down? Right? Like you miss a green light because the person in front of you is driving the speed limit and you lose it, right? You can't stand it. It's infuriating. And sometimes you blow up to such a degree that you even surprise yourself. And you're like, man, I thought I was a chill person. I thought I was kind of relaxed, easygoing, but this doesn't really seem to fit with that. Why do I get so mad every time I'm in the car? Why do I get so mad every time I'm driving? And it's not that complicated. It's because you're always driving in a rush. It's because we live in an almost constant state of hurry. And what it does to us is it just makes us less patient and more angry. But it's not even just that. It's also, I think this plays into our relationship with God in a very significant way. I think this affects the closeness of relationship, the depth of relationship that we feel with God, because I think it dulls our sensitivity to Him. I think it dulls our sensitivity to the Spirit of God. So we miss out on that closeness, but also we miss the things that God is calling us to. Sometimes we just blow right past them. Let me show you what I mean. Right? There was this study, this fascinating study conducted by Princeton Seminary, and it went like this. They were doing their study on students who were set to preach sermons on the Good Samaritan, right? The Good Samaritan of all stories, right? It's all about responding well to these interruptions into our lives, right? A ministry of interruption. And the study worked like this. They wanted to make sure that every one of these students, they made sure that when they were on their way to preach, that they came across somebody who was clearly in need. And they wanted to see which students would stop and help and which students would just keep on going. And they wanted to know why. And what they found was that the number one determining factor didn't actually have to do with getting the passage right. It wasn't about getting the correct interpretation of the story and understanding it. It wasn't even about their beliefs at all. And it wasn't any sort of natural kindness that they either had or didn't have from birth. The number one determining factor in whether or not they stopped when they came across somebody who was clearly in need of help was just how hurried they felt when they came across them. It was just the degree of rush they were in when they came across the person. If they weren't in a rush, they almost always stopped. But if they were in a hurry, they almost never did. Because they had somewhere to be. They had a sermon to preach. And my question is, how many times have we missed what God was calling us into because we were in too much of a hurry? Right? How many times was there some interruption into our schedule or some inconvenient thing that we just kind of blew right past as quick as we could because we were trying to get to this other thing, when in actuality, God was inviting us into something, right? He had something for us, but we just blew past it because we were trying to get to this other thing, and we missed what God had for us because we were in too much of a rush. Right? And the question is, how many times? How many times has that happened? And so it has all these negative effects, right? It makes us less patient and more angry. Right? It exacerbates the sin in our lives, right? It makes us miserable people. It leads us to have a dulled sensitivity to God. But even more than all of that, I think the thing that we need to consider before we'll finally get this is I think we just kind of need to drill down underneath the surface and answer the question, why are we so committed to such a fast pace of life in the first place? Why are we so committed? And why is the thought of slowing down so quickly dismissed for us? Why is that so hard to actually take into consideration? And I think the answer is because we're actually a whole lot more committed to this pace of life than we would ever imagine. I think our commitment actually runs a whole lot deeper than we expect. Because I think the thing that drives us and the thing that actually keeps us living at such a fast pace is just fear. It's because we're afraid. Fear is the thing that keeps us moving so fast. And I think this works itself out in a couple of different ways, right? For some of us, it's kind of this fear of insignificance or this fear of missing out. And so basically, we're worried that we're going to get to the end of our lives and we're going to have basically done nothing, that we'll have lived a life of insignificance, and we'll have missed out on all of these experiences, and we'll have accomplished nothing. And so it's actually the fear of that happening that drives us to fill every waking moment and every season of our life with some accomplishment, right? So some experience with something we're trying to get done so that we can make sure that when we get to the end of our lives, we'll know that we lived a full and a significant life, right? Because we'll have filled every moment of it. But the question is, how will you ever know when you've actually done enough? Even the way that that's posed, you won't know till the end of your life. And I bet that the case is when you get there, you're still not going to know. You're never going to get to a place where you actually feel like you've done enough so you can rest. And the fear is just going to keep pushing you and keep goading you and keep driving you to live in a way that's way beyond your limits. Right? That's way beyond what you're even capable of. And it's driving you to a way of life that's damaging to you. So I think that's how it works for some people. Right? But for others, I think it's not so much a fear of missing out or a fear of insignificance. I think it's actually a fear of disappointing other people. I think it can be a fear of letting others down. Right? And I think this happens with our work a lot, right? Where there's times where we'll find ourselves in seasons where the work, it just keeps piling up and the projects keep stacking, and we're doing everything we can to keep up. Right, we're cutting out time we're cutting out exercise, we're working, we stay up late, we wake up early, we're putting in time on the weekends, we cut out quiet times, we cut out times for ourselves, we even cut out time with our family, right, because we're doing everything we can just to keep up with the workload. And I get it that there are some seasons that call for that, and the reality is we just really need to put in the work and keep up and get it done. We just need to do that sometimes, but also, I think sometimes we get so addicted to that fast pace of life that even when the busy season is finally over, and when it's finally done, and we actually can slow down, we don't. Even when we're able to, we don't slow down. And I think the thing that gets us there initially is that we're afraid of disappointing other people, of dropping the ball on this thing or that thing, afraid of setting boundaries and saying no. I think that's what gets us there initially. But what keeps us there, I think, is that we get so used to this feeling of being needed and to the attention that comes with accomplishment that we're actually willing to trade all those other pieces of life for what hurry can bring us. We're willing to make that trade. And the thing is, it's a terrible trade. It's a bad trade because it's not worth your health. It's not worth your relationships. It's not worth your family. It's not worth your life. It's not worth it. It's not worth it. Because you're trading all of those things for a life that ultimately is driven by fear. And a life that's driven by fear can only leave you miserable. And it'll make you miserable to be around because that's not what God has for us. It's not what He has for us, right? To perpetually live beyond our limits in a way that's unsustainable. And so my hope is that after walking through all that, we're finally at a place where we're ready to ask the question, well, okay, so how do I actually slow down? I realize that this is running a little bit deeper than maybe I thought it was. This is a little bit more ingrained into me. How do I actually change the shape of my life to slow down? Because it's not the most easy thing to do. It's not the simplest thing. And let me just say, if we're finally at the point where we're wanting to ask and answer that question, if that's what we're looking to figure out, then we're finally at a place where we can understand why the homework that Paul gave us at the beginning is actually good news, is actually something that we should be glad to do. Because this is what we see, right? When we take a little bit closer look at fear, right? Fear, the thing that drives us to this way of life, if we just slow down and dissect it and analyze it a little bit, what we see is that it's actually not so big and scary. But all that fear is just another symptom of the sickness that we all have. Right? The fear that's shaping our lives is just a symptom of sin. Right? And the truth is, we do still continue to struggle with sin, but there's some good news in that. Because while we still continue to struggle, right, and we still have these symptoms, there is also some medicine. There is also some medicine, and there is one who is ready to administer it to us. Because that medicine is the gospel, which truly is the power of God for salvation. Because it's the only thing that can lead us to live a life that's driven not by fear, but by love. right? To shape our lives in such a way so it's not driven by this fear and this need to keep up, to fill every waking moment, to live in a way that's unsustainable, but we can live from the place of love, from the place of approval, knowing that God is there for us and He's got us. And we can live from the love that we see revealed in no place other than the gospel of Jesus Christ. Because when we take that medicine and we live in that way, it's an entirely different story. It's an entirely different story. But the thing is, the medicine only works when we take it and when we shape our lives in such a way that allows us to. And so to go back to the question at the beginning, why should we do this? Right? Why do we need to do this? And why should we be glad to put these things into practice? It's because what comes with obedience to this, right, to shaping our lives in this way, what it can deliver is truly the joy and the peace and the life that we long for. That's what it can deliver. And the thing is, all the alternative can provide, right, is a life that makes us less patient and more angry, right, is a life that dulls our sensitivity to God and ruins our relationship with Him, right, and a life that ultimately is designed to implode. It's not meant to last. It's trying to cause us harm. So those are the choices. And if that doesn't convince you, then I really don't know what else to say. And so it's with that I want to move into our third and final point now. Practices of participation. Practices of participation, because this is what we see, right? Practices of participation. The question is how? Right, the question is, how do we live in such a way that's in step with the Spirit? How do we take our medicine? How do we live in a way that allows us to be shaped by the Spirit of God and to live in step with Him? And I think a significant piece of that answer is something I call practices of participation. Right? And I think calling them that is helpful because it helps us to keep the proper framework. If we go back to Romans 12:1, we see that it says, or 12:2, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Remember that verb is passive, be transformed. But it's commanded, so we do have a role to play, but also it's passive. And so the Holy Spirit is the one bringing about this renewal and this transformation in our lives. And the role that we play is to participate with the Spirit of God. And I think one of the most significant pieces of that for us is actually these practices of participation. And people have called them different things throughout time, right? People have called them spiritual disciplines, mind-body habits, spiritual practices. They've called them different things, right? But I like the practices of participation, because it gives that framework that we're participating with the Spirit of God. And what they do is they give us a chance just to slow down and to be quiet and to cultivate a sensitivity to God so that we can live a life that's not rushed and hurried. And we can live a life that participates in our renewal and live a life that, as the passage goes on to say, live a life that allows us to have a sense and an understanding of what the will of God is, right, in certain situations. That's the payoff. Right, the payoff is big. And so I just want to talk about two of these. Right? The first is solitude and silence. Solitude and silence. And undoubtedly, throughout the history of the church, this is the most significant spiritual practice. Jesus himself, he actually practiced this. We see all throughout the Gospels, the biographies of his life, that he was constantly carving out time just to get away from all of the noise of life and work and ministry, just to get by himself and to be alone in the quiet and to spend some time with God in prayer. Not necessarily lifting up all these requests and going through his list of things, but just spending time with God, just being with him, because he drew strength from that. And we do as well. And if I'm honest, I think a significant cause of a lot of our restlessness, of our feeling so distant from God, and even of our lack of spiritual depth, I think it comes from a lack of solitude and silence. It comes because this is missing. I mean, Henry Nouwen, who's a theologian who's known for his wisdom concerning the spiritual life, he put it like this. He said, without solitude, it is virtually impossible to live a spiritual life. We do not take the spiritual life seriously if we do not set aside some time to be with God and listen to him. We don't take it seriously. He's saying it doesn't matter what your role is. There's not a whole lot of exceptions in the language there. It doesn't matter if you're a pastor. It doesn't matter if you're a small group leader. If you don't set this time aside, then you're not taking it seriously. And so in other words, there is no shortcut, right? There's no other avenue. If we want to cultivate a depth in our relationship with God, if we want to participate in our renewal and not be conformed into this rushed and hurried life, it starts here. Right? It starts by building these rhythms of solitude and silence into our lives. And so if this is new for you, maybe it's just 10 minutes. Or maybe it's just 10 minutes a day. But if this is something you've been doing for a while, I think we should push ourselves on this. I think we should push ourselves to maybe add 10 minutes onto what we already did. Maybe find another time throughout the day. But we need to cultivate this. So that's the first one. And the second one's this. It's the idea of the Sabbath. Right? The Sabbath, which it just comes from the Hebrew word Shabbat from the Old Testament, which literally just means to stop or to cease. And it's the idea of taking one day a week to not do any work, right? To not do anything, and to just spend the day in rest and in worship. The first place we see this is actually in the opening pages of the Bible itself, right? In the creation account. We see that God, it says he made everything in 6 days, and on the seventh he rested. This is what it says in Genesis 2:3. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, right? He blessed it because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. He blessed it. And that's a significant point to make note of, because he only blesses two other things in the creation account. And in both of those instances, the blessing has to do with this fruitfulness and this multiplying. Right? And so what it means is that there's a fruitfulness that comes with blessing. Right? There's a fruitfulness that comes with living within the blessing of God. And one of the ways that we do that is by practicing a Sabbath, because God has blessed it, meaning it's for our good. And we neglect it to our own detriment. Jesus himself, he picked up on this in the Gospels when he said, the Sabbath was made for man. It was made for us, not man for the Sabbath, which, yes, that means we don't need to be legalistic about keeping it. Right? But at the same time, that means that it was actually created for our good. Just like oil changes were made for cars. And so we neglect it. If we neglect it, we're neglecting our own good. Right? We're doing it to our own detriment. And really all we're trying to do is to live beyond what we're capable of. But we're trying to do more than what we're actually capable of and live beyond our limitations so that we can do more, so we can achieve more and have a fuller life. But the reality is, when we do that, all we have is less, because we're stepping outside of the blessing of God. And it just makes life dull and draining and empty. That's all that it does, because part of living within the blessing of God is living within our limits. And God gave us the Sabbath to make very clear what our limits are. That's why he even puts this in the 10 Commandments, to show that it's that important. He puts taking this one day right alongside murder. Right? He stresses it that much. And so it matters. And maybe the question is, how do we do this? Right? What does it actually look like to take a Sabbath? And I just say, it's pretty simple, right? It just means taking one day a week. And it doesn't have to even be Saturday or Sunday, just whatever day works for you. But you take one day a week and you just spend it in worship and in rest. And I mean those two categories in the broadest sense, right? If cutting grass is restorative for you, if that's restful, then go ahead and do that. All right, if eating ice cream makes you delight in God, then go ahead and have some ice cream worshipfully, right? Enjoy that. Just don't overcomplicate it. Keep it simple. If it fits within those two categories, broadly speaking, then just enjoy it and enjoy the day. It's meant to bless you, and it just takes a little intentionality. All right, now as we get ready to close, because I do believe this is the longest I've ever gone in a sermon, so thank you for your grace. But as we get ready to close, let me just say this. St. Augustine, one of the greatest theologians in all of church history, he said this. He said, our hearts are restless until they rest in you. Our hearts are restless until they rest in you, meaning until they rest in God. And he was right, because there truly is a rest that we've been welcomed into, that we've been invited to. And as we put in the work to slow down, right, to set boundaries, and to resist these pressures that would conform us to such a fast and a hurried pace of life, and as we work to build these practices of participation into our lives to bring about our renewal, we'll begin to experience the blessing that comes with living within our limits. Right? The blessing of that rest that can only be found by walking slowly with our God. And church, I hope we'll do the work to enter into that, to slow our lives down so we can be with God. Would you pray with me? God, we thank you that you're not a God who's in a rush, that you're not in a hurry. And so we thank you for the blessing that comes with that. And we do ask that you would shape us as individuals, as families, as a people, as a church, that you would lead us to slow our lives down. so that we can walk more closely with you. And Father, would we experience the blessing that comes with living within our limits and the fullness of life that's found within it. All these things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.